I have a couple of questions before I get started for you. How many of you are in the IH program, Industrial Hygiene? So a good number. How about some of the others? What's your background? Don't all talk at once. Some of the EPI students are here? Maybe a few? So, okay, so about 50%. So what I want to talk about today is basically environment, health, and safety at a large electric utility. And the reason I use this, and I'm using it mostly as an example for all of you, because eventually you'll graduate and get jobs. At least your parents hope you will. So, and some of you. And I want to use this. Many people probably don't even think about some of these other kinds of industrial programs that are available, but I want to give you an idea of the range of activities that a large utility offers and where you can use your skills. And as I go along, I'll talk about some of that. So, let's see. Okay. Southern California Edison is an example of a very large utility. If you see the map, it covers half of California. And so it provides 50,000 square mile territory. 12 million people are served by electricity and has 12,000 employees. So it's a huge operation and been in business for over 100 years. So the question is, and I'll go, what's that have to do with EH&S and your background? So first of all, it's an investor-owned utility, and there's really two kinds of utilities in the country, and there's two. If you live in Los Angeles, you get electricity from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and that is owned by the people of the city of Los Angeles. Edison, however, is an investor-owned utility, and that means that there's actually shareholders that expect to make a profit out of selling of electricity. Makes a difference in how you work at a place like that, and I'll talk about that as we go on. And they're regulated by different groups. So what's a utility do? You know, obviously, power generation, wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, coal, geothermal. If you're in the environmental sciences, you know coal is on the way out, probably, but probably never completely gone. Geothermal is useful in some places. There's some geothermal in California. Solar, as you know, is very big now. There's solar here at UCLA. Wind is also important. It adds up. So there's generation. So utilities generate electricity. And then there's transmission. So how do you get electricity that you generate to the place that you need it? So if you think about it, wind, you don't see any wind turbines here around Los Angeles, but this is a place where electricity is used. The wind is elsewhere, and so transmission is how you bring the electrons down into the LA basin. So they're two very different functions. And then distribution. So there's really three aspects. Distribution is how you get, you know, when you drive around, you see these huge 500 megawatt power poles. Eventually, it goes into distribution and into your house. So when you plug in something at 110 volts, you don't get 500,000 volts and blow your house apart. So this is just a simple graphic of what goes on. And the important part for all of you in industrial hygiene is that at every step along the way, there's a need for industrial hygiene. So here's power plants, and I'll talk about it. There's noise, so there's hearing protection, there's chemical exposure. Power plants have emission, and so you have air quality issues, high voltage transmission lines. people have to get up on those and work on them. So you have safety issues, fall protection. Then you get down to transformers. You know, people have heard here, I'm sure, about PCBs. You know, PCBs and transformers, huge environmental problem that most of the utilities have taken care of. And then eventually, power lines down to a house. So at every one of those steps, there's an issue related to environmental sciences. And if you think about a 50,000 square mile area, that's a lot of things that go on. Typical power plant, filled with chemicals, filled with hazards. Trying to keep workers safe is a big issue, and at the same time, dealing with air quality. So major need. Same with these power lines. There's people that actually, hey, how you doing? Climb those power lines and work on 500,000 volt power lines. So a lot of safety issues, a lot of fall protection issues along the way. So in terms of environmental protection, and so I had the industrial hygienists. Are there any of you that are interested in sort of the environmental aspects? Any hands? Somebody? Somebody's? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So obviously, a big utility has a footprint that steps on the environment. I mean, there's no way around it. And if you look in the newspaper, everywhere else, there's some big issues now related to avian protection and solar power. If you've seen the LA Times, many of the solar facilities have the habit of killing birds. And so because of the light, same with the wind towers. And so you run into issues where you're trying to protect the environment. You don't want to burn coal and have toxic exhaust, so you go to these other less environmentally damaging things, but you run into other issues. And I guess one of the things that I hope you get from my talk is that if you do environmental health and industrial hygiene and you go out into the real world, you end up having to balance these two things. You just can't come in and say, here's the data, that's the way it goes. It doesn't happen like that. I mean, you have to make your best case and work on them. Heritage resource, Southern California Edison has archaeologists, because sometimes when you're doing power lines through the desert, you run into ancient dwellings or other things. Marine mitigation, I'll talk about. Obviously, air quality compliance is a big issue. Have any of you been to Catalina Island, for instance? Off the coast? Okay. So does anyone know where Catalina Island gets its electricity? No, I didn't think so. So I never thought about it either until I joined. So it turns out Edison, through some sort of deal, decades and decades ago, ended up with the electrical generation in Catalina Island. Catalina Island only has 6,000 residents, but it has thousands of people that come there during the summer for vacation. So low energy demand and then huge energy demand. Turns out that the energy over there is generated by diesel, of all things. So there are hotspots there that have some of the worst air quality around. And the question is, do you run an extension cord from the mainland, which we actually looked at, and it was something like $150 million. Do you charge the 6,000 people, do you divide it up amongst them and say, yeah, here's your electricity, what's 6,000 into 150 million, this is your bill. So that isn't acceptable. There's not enough solar or land over there. And so the issues become, how do you work on that and mitigate things so that people have electricity, which is necessary for life at this point, but at the same time not have a major impact on the environment and health of people. So because it's a big utility, it has impact and working relationships with literally over 100 different facilities, federal, state, local. It crosses so many cities. And this, again, don't take this as Edison itself. It's just a large utility. CalOSHA for work, California Public Utilities Commission, they set the rates. City of Upland, California EPA, the Federal Army Corps of Reserve, California Coastal Commission, and I'll talk about that in a while. One of the areas that it's important if you get into IH or some of these other fields to know the regulatory environment, because it drives most of what you would end up doing. And so here are some of the ones that you would work with at California Coastal Act, which is in the paper a lot. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So you say, well, what's that have to do? Well, it turns out it's against federal law to kill certain kinds of birds. And so if you have a bird that nests in a power line and dies because it gets electrocuted, that can be a federal violation. So you have to have a program in place. You have to study bird migration and do what's necessary to either cover lines in certain areas. California Designated Plant Act. You say, well, what's that? How about putting big solar fields out in the desert? And so all of these require people, maybe some of you, to know these things and work on them in terms of developing project plans that are good for the environment, but at the same time allow the bigger picture of delivering energy. So interpret and implement federal and state EHS. Thousands of regs come out all the time, and it becomes the responsibility of an EH&S program to monitor these regulations and make sure that the company's in compliance. And I'm sure many of you have seen the Northern California, Pacific Gas and Electric, had the huge gas explosion up in Northern California, killed a number of people, leveled some neighborhoods, weren't really following the federal guidelines for gas pipe inspection and all of that. So there's a lot of push now for people to be in compliance, and to be in compliance, you have to know what compliance is. You can't just say, do this. You have to follow that. And it's a niche, but it's an important one, and a lot of people that graduate in EHS end up in those kinds of positions. So to just give you an idea, in terms of Edison, so you have almost 400 air quality permits. So these are diesel generators for backup, peaker plants which generate discharge, making sure that things come out, air permits, business contingency plans. This is where you have your hazardous materials and you need to sort of know what you will do if something goes wrong. Spill prevention plans, stormwater plans. So those are all things in the early years of utilities that they didn't pay a lot of attention to. And there's still many parts in this country, different from California, where it's pretty lax until there's some sort of environmental nightmare. And I think, again, you've probably all seen where there's been a spill, some of the mining industries in particular, where rivers get polluted. It's because they don't either have spill prevention plans in place or they haven't done the necessary work to prevent those from happening. So this gives you a rough idea. I mean, this is just some graphics. Edison has 1,000 facilities. That's a lot of facilities, over 50,000 square miles. This one, you might recognize, that's the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, SONGS, which is now inactive because of a leak. So it's going to be demolished at some point over time. Part of the problem is all the radioactive material is still on site, which is causing a lot of consternation for the neighbors that live near there. The problem is, again, as some of you may know or have studied it, there's no national policy or plan for the storage of nuclear waste. And so a lot of it just ends up there. This is 500 yards from the coastline. And so probably not the best thing. This is actually Catalina Island and the facility over there. And you can see some of the others. A lot of the early Edison work was hydro. So there are a lot of, in the high Sierras, there are a lot of dams and other facilities for generating power that way. And again, a lot of health and safety issues related to hydro because, in particular, noise level, tremendous noise level in the hydro plants, and the whole issue of worker protection is important. So I guess a couple of the things, again, that you need to think about when you take a job like this, and I would say you have to be cautious. You don't want to go everywhere because some industrial facilities don't take this kind of work seriously, and it usually doesn't happen until there's been some sort of issue. And I can tell you, because it was in the paper and I was involved in it, UCLA got into that kind of trouble. I actually came here after UCLA was found to be guilty of dumping body parts in Santa Monica Bay. And this was a long time ago, but it caused a lot of grief. It caused the feds to come after UCLA, caused a lot of problems, and it was, at that time, nobody really thought that much about EH&S on a campus. Well, it turns out it's a big issue. There's thousands of lab buildings, there's lots of chemicals. At that time, there was a facility for incinerating medical waste, which turned out hadn't been permitted. And so just a major problem. After that, UCLA, I guess you'd say, got religion and has been in compliance ever since. And this was in the early 90s. But it's important, when you start looking for jobs, to make sure, you have to ask some questions too about how the company feels about some of these regs, because you don't want to end up in some facilities where they don't think it's important. And then, the whole issue about demonstrating environmental stewardship. You need to work with the community. That's a major issue. You have to get used to it. You just can't give data and say, this is what we're going to do. You have to listen to people and work with them. And that's important. I think it's one of the skills that you need to learn as you go out and start working, and maintain a stringent self-regulation plan. Got to do internal audits. It's one thing to send out letters to all the staff and say, hey, you have to do this. People don't always do that. You have to check and make sure there are, and you have to have management's authority then to take corrective action if it happens. And that's particularly true as we get out to talk about the safety issues. So again, managing environmental projects is important, and I'll talk about towards the end the San Onofre marine mitigation projects, and I'll talk about the San Miguel Lagoon and kelp reef project. Stormwater problems, all of the issues now have gotten stronger. Stormwater has toxics in it. There's no question that things that wash off streets end up in rivers and lakes, and you don't want that to happen. And then following the air quality issues. So a lot of environmental issues. One of the things that happens if you're an old facility, you've been around for over 100 years, you pay for the sins of the people that came before you. So in the early days, when people disposed of hazardous waste, they just poured it in the ground. It's, hey, hazardous waste, we don't need it. There are several facilities Visalia pole yard that made power poles. And what they did was dip them in all sorts of toxic materials, all sorts of organics to prevent termites and everything else. All of that eventually leached into the groundwater, and we're talking, decades and decades ago. And so it's been a big program, and in fact, that top one was the first one that was actually cleared by the EPA that said it was remediated. Alhambra is a facility. And then, this is an example of Santa Barbara manufactured gas plants. At the turn of the century, there wasn't really gas distribution, so you've seen those old pictures of gas lamps and in fact, I think San Diego has a gas lamp district, and so a lot of that gas was actually manufactured on site. They were actually, cooking coal and things like that and turning it into gas and then throwing the rest into the ground. So there are legacy plants all across the country, and some still in California that are toxic waste sites. So there's a fair amount of work that still goes on remediation and obviously environmental control. And I think this is one of the ones in Long Beach. And then this is the Pebbley Beach facility where the generation is in Catalina. Been a lot of spills over there and into groundwater. So those are ongoing. This one is actually remediated now. So how about the health and safety program? So you saw the number of employees, thousands of employees spread out over 50,000 square miles. And then you also have a responsibility to your customers. You have to have lines that are safe so that they come into everyone's house. You saw 12 million people are touched by it. How do you get that through training? And you've probably seen billboards around Southern California every now and then about don't touch down power lines. Some of you have seen those. Yeah, that's a major issue after windstorms, and there's been a number of fatalities where people will go out and they'll see a line in their backyard and they grab it and get electrocuted, and then one of their relatives sees them and tries to pull them away and they get electrocuted. And there was one just like that near San Bernardino probably about 4 years ago. So there's a responsibility when you're delivering what's basically a hazardous product to make sure your employees are safe and that everyone else is safe. So what are the kinds of programs we're talking about? Hearing protection, it's a big issue. I talked about internal audits and compliance. So one of the big issues is making sure people take the proper precautions, whether they're in a noisy environment. Monitoring for hearing loss is common. Radiation safety, obviously, at a nuclear plant is huge. People wear dosimeters. Fall protection, you saw the poles. People have to go up on poles, and so the idea is it's better to have them go up on bucket trucks instead of climbing. But people fall, and that's been a big issue. One of the problems that we had right after, remember the station fire, which is in the San Gabriel Mountains about 4 years ago, took out a lot of the power lines, and 2 of the linemen climbed the pole. They're tied off and they're trying to restring wires. What they didn't look at, which is part of their regulation, is there's supposed to be, or there is, a little marker that lets people know if they see it, that the pole is in the ground adequately. If it's here, it's supposed to be here, that means the ground has eroded, and this is after the rain. They climbed up, they never looked at that. The pole fell over, and they were tied to it, and 2 of them rolled down the hill on it, and it just, they both lived, but severe injuries because they didn't follow the safety plan. So that's And then chemical exposure, obviously, is a big issue because there's a lot of hazardous chemicals, cleaning compounds, in a big facility like that, all of those. And the EMF studies, electromagnetic studies, because of potential there in certain areas. So a lot of work goes into that in designing lines to make sure they're low. Again, the same sorts of things, trying to manage this. And again, there's the line. You can see covers everywhere. This is Los Angeles, which is DWP, so it's not there. Riverside has their own little electrical company, but overall, it's about half of California that has the area. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about a couple of projects. One was mandated when the Santa nuclear generating station was permitted. That installation uses seawater for cooling. Okay, so it takes in seawater, cools down the nuclear reactor, and then takes it out. What happens is the big pumps that come in tend to kill fish larvae, and things like that. So the Coastal Commission deemed it was necessary, if you're going to have this kind of impact on the environment, you need to do something to balance that out. And that's something else that you'll see a lot of times if you get into this industrial world, where if you want to build something here and it's going to have some environmental impact, you may have to trade land somewhere else and put it, say, this won't be touched in perpetuity to help balance or mitigate these projects. So there are a number of thoughts. How do we mitigate this? How do we, we're obviously going to do some damage to the environment, and so look at the timeline. These things also go on forever. I mean, because you look at environments for the project. The San Diego location was approved by the California Coastal Commission. Does anyone know where Del Mar is? Del Mar Racetrack, if you take the 5 down to San Diego, it's off on the rep, near that area. That's the San Diego wetlands. And so they decided to turn this into a park and to rehab it so it could be a wetlands to generate more fish larvae, more migratory birds and all. So again, whenever you see local government, you realize you have lots of people who have a vested interest in this. So it takes meeting after meeting after meeting after year to eventually get agreement. So now we're up to 2,000, looking at various designs. Many eliminated erosion scours. So one of the things in a wetland is if you're not careful, you have a heavy rain year, which I don't know if we're ever going to have again, but you have to plan for it, can completely wash out the wetlands. So you have to design these things. So many of the plans eliminated. So this is an aerial view. So this is I-5. That's the fairgrounds there, Del Mar Racetrack. And so this is the area where the wetlands eventually were set up to connect to get back to the ocean. And what had happened is, at one time this was a military base during World War II, and a lot of these things were closed off to the ocean, so there was no way you could get fish larvae and fish in and out. So the whole idea was to completely renovate this area and make it basically an incubator for fish larvae and all. So court had to go to court, upheld it, 23, getting the permits. City of Del Mar, City of San Diego, regional air. So again, this gives you an idea of the environment that you end up working in. State Fish and Game, obviously, because you're talking about fish. State highways, because it goes under I-5. State Water Quality Board. Shall I keep going? Just everybody in the world. And what happens, too, is other people, because they know you have to do it. The railroad came in. They had a track, and they said, well, you're going to work on this. You're going to wreck our railroad bridge, so we want you to build us a new railroad bridge. And so they could hold it up because they had right-of-way. And so an extra $25 million to build something. State Coastal Commission, Federal Corps of Engineers, flood management. So construction and revegetation, 26 to 10. Okay, so if you remember that first slide, we started in, what, 90-something? And then there's long-term monitoring. And so the interesting thing is, even though San Onofre nuclear plant is not operational anymore, this goes on forever. And part of the thing. So the other project that was part of this is the Wheeler North Reef project. Okay, so again, to get the permit, what they said was the nuclear plant also takes water in, and when it comes out, it's warmer, as you might imagine, because it's cooling water. And so they said it's going to do some damage to the ecosystem around there. And as part of being able to build that, Southern California Edison had to actually build a reef, an artificial reef, to help generate fish and wildlife. So in '99, so this is a long time ago, built an experimental reef and then studied it for 5 years to see if it works. Turns out reefs aren't easy to build. I think nature has a much better way of building them than people. And so the build out for this, the rock was quarried, and it turned out rock for a reef has to be a certain size. Okay, I guess starfish don't like them if they're too big or too small, and kelp. So the project site was off of San Onofre. This gives you an idea. If you've driven down that San Onofre and where the reef is, you can see where it was dropped, where the rocks are dropped along the coastline. And then this is an aerial view that shows the rocks when they were put down in the water. So there's the San Clemente Pier there, and you can see the patches of rock that turn out to be that. So concrete rubble was the first stuff they tried. It didn't work at all. And then the quarry rock, all broken down to just the right, perfect size. And it came out on barges from Catalina and were actually dropped by GPS. So this is not, throwing a bunch of rocks in the ground. This is all done based on the original work. So again, the idea is, for one, if you're interested in environmental work, or if you're interested in industrial hygiene, obviously all of these things require a lot of people to do this kind of work that have technical knowledge, technical skills to help either protect the people that are doing this work or to monitor. So there are a variety of things, and there they are, again, very precisely dropping rocks along the way. And then they actually have scuba divers that come out every couple of months and have been doing it for years to look. They actually go down, look at the rocks, look at the kelp and the fish life to ensure that this mitigation project is working. And so far it is. But all related to minimizing environmental impact from something that has a heavy footprint on the environment. Wind is another issue now. As you know, wind is popular. The wind is up there, it's hundreds of miles away, and the idea is how do you get the power down here? And again, those windmills are huge. I don't know, I assume most of you have seen them. The little top part is about the size of a bus, and many of them are getting even larger because these are becoming 1 and 2 megawatts of power. A lot of power. They're very big. They have a lot of IH issues related to safety of people going up. And when people go up through these into the cabs, there's potential fire hazard up there. Obviously, not good to get hit by one of those blades. And so one of the projects is getting power from up in the north down into Southern California. Very, very difficult because this particular project of getting wind, and I think the facility was called Wind Hub, and I was actually up there when Schwarzenegger was still governor, and he was dedicating the site for it. So all that, have all the power up there, bringing it down through lines that have to go through national forest. Can you imagine? National forests don't allow you to grade roads in a national forest. So all of the high tension lines that are there are dropped by helicopter because you can't do it. And so you have people coming in, pouring concrete from helicopter for the pads and then putting them in. Endangered species along there. Eventually, power comes down to the city of Chino Hills, where there's a big substation. City of Chino Hills sued Edison because they didn't want high tension lines, any more of them coming through their city. So these are long, expensive projects. At one time, because I had the budget for that, just the EH&S budget was $300 million to do that because of hiring biologists to monitor. You actually had the people in the field to make sure that you didn't hurt any tortoises along the way. You had to have people watching, for birds. If a bird starts to nest in one of your towers, you're dead. I mean, you just stay there until, the eggs hatch. And so biologists, archaeologists looking for, Native American habitat. And this project, just went on forever. So this gives you an idea. So the huge helicopters flying in with these power lines to, no footprint, no roads anywhere, hugely expensive, but that's sort of the trade-off between environmental protection and getting power that's consistent, and I'm sure all of you know, if you go over to your house and flip on your light switch and it doesn't work, you're dead. I mean, that's, electricity is way more important and people don't even think about it, and that's the idea until you lose it, and then suddenly you say, oh, that's okay, I'll work on the internet. And you say, well, I can't, or the cells are down and stuff. And so it's really important for modern life. And I think just recently, if you saw gas prices just peaked again. They always peak, but there was a power outage at the refineries in Torrance area, and within 10 minutes, you go to Arco and it's 20 cents a gallon more because they can't refine fuel. Although I don't know what that has to do with the fuel that's already in their tanks, but that's for another lecture. So what I'd like to do is stop now. I have about 5 minutes. Any questions for me? Hopefully get an idea. This is just an example of one industrial kind of facility, and I guess I could call it business. a tremendous need for people with technical skills in IH, environmental. The other thing that's interesting about some of the utilities, they pay very well in terms of what you might expect, way more than assistant professors. And, yeah. And even full professors. I didn't want to say anything. It's actually true. And they're good places. You just have to be cautious when you interview to make sure, if it's any industry, that it fits with your values. And I think people will ask, they ask me, well, I left UCLA as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research and was recruited to Edison. Well, how does it fit? Actually, it fit well. I think if you have enlightened management, they know that's the right thing to do. If they're not enlightened, you don't want to be there. So it's interesting. So any questions, comments? Hopefully it sort of opens your eyes to a whole different... Yeah?
I just had a question about the artificial reef that you did. Was there a reef there that was damaged and that's why they were putting it in?
No, it was just one more reef to help increase, fish production and larvae and things. And one of the former presidents of Edison always used to say, well, it's always a balance between larvae and lights. How many larvae versus how many lights, and that's, those are issues. I think the other thing I didn't touch on, which is I think important for all of you, if you need to take at least a business course or two, because you end up working in an environment where you may have all the data in the world and you've crunched all the numbers and everything. You have to know how to sell it to other people, because you're not going to have the final decision, even if you're the EH&S director. It's usually finance people come in because they'll say, well, why can't we do this? Why can't we do that? And you need to get used to working in that environment. The other thing is, Edison is unionized. All the linemen and everything work for the IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electric Workers. And so that's another overlay in terms of work rules. And that really comes in during safety. How many belts do you use when you climb? And the union has their rules, and people are falling, and you say, well, what's the best way? So you have to learn to work in that kind of environment too. And that goes for many of the places you go to. It's not just, don't come in as the IH and say, hey, this is toxic, it's out of here. You have to also come up with plans where people can continue to do their work, do it safely, but at the same time, know how to negotiate those things. But it can be a dangerous environment. When last I looked, about over 50 people have died in the line of duty at Edison, and that's not unusual. Most of it is because they don't follow the safety rules. They forget to test a line to see if it's live before they do some work on it, get electrocuted, or they do other things that they're trying to cut corners. So it takes a lot of culture changing too, and there's a lot of work that goes on in terms of trying to change culture and holding supervisors responsible. Having a tailgate meeting before people start talking through, well, what are the potential hazards? What do we do? And those sorts of things. And a lot of that's actually sociology. You almost need to be a psychiatrist to get people to understand how important it is. So, any other questions or comments? Okay, so you got 3 extra minutes.
Do you have any comment about the current outsourcing of the EHS functions at Edison?
How they're doing now?
Well, they're outsourcing most of the environmental health and safety functions. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't know exactly what's going on. What has happened, Edison has downsized considerably. They had, because of a lot of this work, the ranks had swollen with all this capital improvement. They had layoffs of, I think, 3,000 people over time. For some of the functions, they're actually outsourcing. So it's the same work, but they're not employees, so they don't have the same responsibility for retirement plans and all of those things. So the same functions are going on, but they're not always with Edison employees at this point.
Yeah, we had 2 former students who were victims
Yeah.
of the gas frozen.
Yeah, no, a lot of the people that I knew, and it went all the way to some of the former senior VPs. I mean, it was brutal for a while, but the functions remain, and so many of the people that were there are now there, but they're with another company, and that's always been something, I guess, in utilities and other industries where they hire a lot of individuals for, like a 3-year position to do work, and then that work is done and they don't want to hold on to them. But it's also a good way, again, for some people to get started in the industry and get experience, because that's the tough part, to be able to do that. So, yes?
In the last 45 seconds, I was wondering if you could speak to the promises and pitfalls you see from distributed generation being small-scale
Okay.
users, residential, or just from the environmental impact perspective,
Okay.
but also...
So I do teach a class on that, as I told you, over in the IOES. The challenge is it's evolving so quickly, it's amazing. Distributed generation is, for instance, you having solar on your house and being able to put energy back into the grid. The grid was always designed to just push electricity out. And so they talk about the smart grid, where you'll have your Prius and you charge it with electricity, and then if electricity goes down, your Prius is hooked into the grid and the battery starts powering other places. It's great, but it's a long way off. I mean, it's just technically the ability to switch things back and forth and load management. Problem is, we get a lot of power from wind in California, mostly at night, and the need for the power is in the daytime. And around 6 o'clock when people come home and they turn on their power. So balancing all of that is really, it's tough. And so again, a lot of people working on it to make things happen.
I'll check out your class.
Okay.
So, thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What are the priorities if you're enrolled in the class?